So, for everyone who is here, and I'm sure some will trickle in as we get started, we are here to talk about accessible and inclusive design, mostly on the web, but also talking about kind of at large, what does accessibility and inclusivity mean in both the digital and physical world?
Let's talk a little bit about who we are concerning Verndale. So if you don't know who we are, Verndale is a digital agency that specializes in uh, web design and digital design. We are located in 4 different areas across the world: Boston, Minneapolis, Los Angeles, and Quito, Ecuador. We can go to the next slide, Zach. And a little bit about who we are. I'll introduce myself. My name is Chris Anthony. I'm a visual design lead here at Verndale. I have 10 years of experience in the industry. Most of those have been spent with Zach. We work alongside, or we have been for a majority of our careers, and happy to be talking through this stuff with him today.
And I'm Zach Tatu. Also been in the industry 10 plus years through all sorts of different things. I started as a coder, moved into UX, and then into product. So I've got a good grasp of a lot of different areas, and accessibility is something that I've been paying a lot of attention to for quite some time. So what we want to talk about today is a pretty quick breakdown is defining accessible and inclusive design, how we see them as a little bit different, accessible design in the real world, personifying accessibility, talking about what it means to think of your users and what their needs are and how to address them, why it's important. And then finally, that you don't need to be super simple looking on the web to actually be accessible. There's a lot of design freedom. There's a lot of interesting things you can do to become accessible and stay accessible. So at a high level, just defining what are these things. So web accessibility in general is making sure that your websites and digital tools are usable by the general public, regardless of any of their special needs they may have. So if there's important information that a user needs to be able to access, they can do so. That means things like navigating, clicking different features and functions, and being able to understand any sort of context through imageries. So some of the different disabilities that affect the web include auditory, cognitive, neurological, physical, speech, and visual. There's a lot of examples that fall into those buckets that we're going to cover, and those generally kind of bulk up into 3 general areas that we'll discuss as well. And then Chris is going to walk through what we think about compliance and inclusion.
Awesome. Yeah. And also, while people are kind of listening in and following along, to feel free to leave comments and questions, and um, our colleague Stephanie will help kind of field those as we get them. But when we look at compliance and inclusion in regards to web design, we like to kind of bucket them out into these 2 different sections. First is compliance, which is really the rules. If we were to like break it into black and white definitions. These are kind of, I'm not a lawyer, but the rules that would not get you sued or in legal trouble based on your website. So if you follow these rules, you're in the clear. When we look at inclusion is, do we want to make our experience as helpful and as useful to as many people as possible? So while it might not have legal ramifications, there are some kind of maybe ethical and maybe personal reasons, or just in just good natured spirit, making sure that your kind of product or tool or whatever it is you're designing and building works for the most amount of people possible.
And it's a mindset. Compliance in my head is you doing the checklist things so that you're covered. Inclusion is a mindset of I truly want to make sure everyone can be emerged and immersed in my content.
So we talk about who are we kind of considering when we think about accessibility. We went to the CDC just to get stats based on the US. So I know there might be some folks out there from Canada, or maybe that work at international companies. So these numbers might even get larger when you start thinking about the number of people that live with disabilities globally. I know we work with a lot of global companies, but for the sake of this data set, we pulled disabilities in the US. And we're happy to talk through kind of what those numbers look like in regards to users on the internet.
So the three major buckets that these fall under is cognitive, physical, and sensory. So cognitive means things that you have difficulty for adhering to, understanding, and taking in information. So this could apply to things like dyslexia, ADHD, autism, vertigo, any of those things that make it a little bit more challenging for you to parse and perceive content. Second major one is physical and mobile disabilities. So while you may not think this is always something that is important, you may think of someone who is in a wheelchair. Wheelchair maybe doesn't affect this quite as much, but limited motor control does. Things like arthritis may make using a mouse very difficult. You may have more temporary things such as a broken limb or sprains that make using the keyboard or just general discomfort an everyday thing while browsing the web. So it's a rather large bucket that has a lot of pretty common cases. And then finally, sensory disabilities. So things that affect all of your basic senses. How well do you see things? How well do you hear things? All of those can affect the different content. Major ones people think of are colorblind, deaf, hard of hearing. All of those affect different ways that you might adjust your content and plan for your content to be able to accommodate their needs.
So how can we design and address these accessibility needs in the tools and the products that we work with every day? This is just almost another way of looking at the stats we were just looking at with percentages as opposed to the millions in population. But on the left side, you can see it broken out with based on kind of accessibility need and the type of design treatment or kind of tool that these users would use to navigate the internet. So those with cognitive disabilities typically rely on layout, spacing, and content design. How is everything spaced? Is it kind of evenly distributed across the page? Is there proper hierarchy between like sections? Is there proper hierarchy between sections that end and then begin anew? For physical disabilities, people often rely on screen readers, tabbing, spacing across the site. So when I say screen readers, if you aren't familiar, there are devices that will scan a website and kind of read back the content to you. So we want to make sure that all content is readable by these tools. So and maybe even like alt tags on images need to be considered and things like that. When we say tabbing, if you use the tab button on your keyboard, sometimes you'll see like a little kind of focus state pop up across the navigation and it'll move you through the experience. That is what we mean when we refer to tabbing. Users that use the tab button on their keyboard to navigate a website. We want to make sure that we're building a website so that it's in order and we have an appropriate flow for when users use the tab button. And then last, of course, but not least, the sensory bucket. For those users, they typically rely on designers to implement proper contrast ratios. That's why we lean into the WCAG, I think it's 2.1 or 2.2 levels so heavily. We want to make sure that those are hitting the compliance levels for people with vision disabilities. And we want to make sure that layout and hierarchy is still a prominent piece of our design toolbox when we're designing these so that users with sensory disabilities can also properly navigate our experiences.
Okay. So another thing to kind of think about before we hit into the web is the idea that this isn't new. Well, it has become a big thing specifically in the web in the past few years as more guidelines come out and more lawsuits come up. Designing for people who have accessibility needs is not a new thing. It's been around for a really long time, and a lot of major success products started that way and became household items. So some of the ones on the right we're seeing are ones you've probably heard of. We want to talk about them just a little bit to get you thinking of new items that come out that address a need that then turn out to be useful for not just people who have that specific need, but for everyone. One of the kind of major poster childs of this is the Roomba. I think everyone at this point knows someone who has a Roomba or similar device in their house. Initially made for elderly people or people with physical challenges that really couldn't handle the stresses of cleaning their house on a regular schedule, whether it was the bending, the lifting, the extraneous physical activity. It can be challenging for a lot of people. So this kind of vacuum robot was designed with the goal of helping those out. However, a lot of other people just don't want to do that. So Roomba became very popular and it's been a massive success for 20 years at this point. Another big one is OXO brand. So this is another one where the background is creating tools that were easier for someone to use that had arthritis and difficulty using smaller implements. OXO has kind of become the poster child for kitchen utensils that have the larger grips, that have the silicone traction and all of those, but they're not the only brand anymore that does that. And a lot of kitchen products that come out are these types of assistive tools built that way that everyone benefits from. Things like lemon squeezers and garlic presses these days, instead of being narrow metal filaments, they're larger. They've got plastic exteriors. They're easier to hold. They form to your hand. All of those things initially started as addressing needs, but became things that people just expect and want.
And so Zach went over a couple really recognizable brand names that kind of got their jump with accessibility as their kind of base, like the whole reason behind their product. I'd like to talk a little bit about a couple products that we might be used to seeing in daily life, but we just didn't associate with it. There's no brand names really attached to it, like the idea of an audiobook. The idea for the audiobook goes way back to the 1930s, where the American Foundation of the Blind would record books and written testaments onto the vinyl records, and blind people could listen to the books back then. Of course, they were limited to maybe like 30 minutes tops. I think those were long ones back then, but now it's kind of ballooned into this billion-dollar industry where almost everybody now listens to audiobooks and preference over the written books. Another kind of fun product that got its start with accessibility are the bendy straws. I think another one from the 1930s, this Joseph, his daughter, was having a hard time drinking out of those tall kind of fountain sodas. And so he kind of rigged it and MacGyvered it in a way to allow her to drink more easily. And then it became a very useful tool at hospitals and things like that, where people had mobility issues and they couldn't, move to a certain angle to drink out of a straw. So these bendy straws actually made it very easy and accessible for these people to just do something so simple, like get a drink of water and stay hydrated while they're under kind of care. Personifying accessibility. So I think there are a few. I think Zach, you're on mute. You saw
Yeah, there
your
we go.
mouth moving. There you go.
Lost track there. Yeah. So next thing, now that we've talked about real world applications, is kind of personifying accessibility, making it a little bit different than just that checklist. I think a lot of people are familiar with WCAG. There's a giant rule set of things to do, but it's difficult to relate that to a why. Why does it matter? Who does it affect? Why are there all these items that I got to factor in? So first one here we're want to talking about is Raina. And these are just sample people. These aren't real people, but they're examples of what might happen. So Raina is a 26-year-old woman. She's determined to complete her bachelor's degree through online school. And she has a lot of common challenges: anxiety, depression, ADHD, things that are going to make focusing really difficult, staying on track much harder, and trying to get motivated to go through large amounts of information just really difficult. The web is really all about that. If you think about going to find a new project and you go to Google something, you're hoping one of the top couple Google answers give you the right one, because you don't want to go through 5 pages of Google to find niche information. You just want it right there. It's even more difficult for someone who does not have the capability to stay focused that long. So some of her frustrations are going to be unintuitive navigation. When I land on that website that I'm hoping is correct, is it clear to me what information you have and where I can find it? Lack of reminders. If there's any context cues or areas where I can get a quick tidbit of what it is, why I was here, things like breadcrumbs, so I understand where I came from, is going to help with any of those cognitive abilities. That clear context cues and content cues. Again, when I'm going through, is there areas like headings that are pointing out to me, this is the type of content you're going to be looking for? Big, bold, something I can scan, so I'm not going to read the whole page. And then finally, monotonous learning materials. If I go somewhere and I'm looking for tools to help me with my problem, does every tool kind of sound the same, feel the same, have instructions that are very much the same, that I'm kind of going to forget where I am and what I'm doing? All of those can be very difficult. So some general needs, cognitive support, making sure that any of these things are thought through intelligently and carefully. So any situation that I'm through, any web page I'm going on, there's a very clear system and hierarchy of what you're telling me, why I should care, and what I'm going to get out of it. Time management, again, making sure your content is precise. Having really large articles is one thing. There's a place in time, research papers, things like that. Absolutely. Detail, content, it's very important. General web pages where you explain basic things, not so much. Do you need more than a sentence or two to explain what somebody needs to do? Usually not. Do you need to write complex wording at a college level? Absolutely not. So time management in that sense and cognitive support of make it simple for me to understand and quick. Textual and visual content, making sure that those are clear and providing those as helpers when I can. If I'm scanning a lot of information and there are useful icons or imagery I can use, I'm going to understand that much quicker than reading a lot of lines of text. And then finally, interactivity and engagement. I may be a user who benefits more from video content. If there is a 10-page article that could get summed up in a 2-minute video, that video is probably what I'm going to lean on. So all of those types of things are areas that we can help her have a better sense of what she's doing. We've also got just kind of a couple of visual examples. And at the end of this, we'll send out some materials that cover all of these things we're talking about, a lot more depth of kind of do's and don'ts, but we wanted to bring up some very simple ones. This first one is navigation. So what we're looking here, it's pretty common if you go to like an e-com site, there's going to be a ton of primary links, search, big buttons in the heading, a lot of utility links. There's a lot of choice. There's a lot of things for me to understand really quickly, and it may be overwhelming to me. So unless you have to, really think about simplifying that down. 7 or less things that I need to look at the nav with really clear and simple understanding of what's here.
I do want to note one thing about the navigation. I think in terms of accessibility, that search bar on an e-com site is actually that's the exception to the rule. So I really like that, Zach, you mentioned that earlier. Users typically know when they're going to some sort of shopping site, the product or the thing that they're looking to buy. So the search bar actually helps them, but most other times, if not all other times, that kind of focus on the search bar really distracts from the user. There might be ways to add a little bit more prominence to it, but just providing a clear and clear, very intuitive navigation is helpful to users as they try to browse your site. So let's talk a little bit about Quora. And another thing I wanted to maybe toot my own horn about is we use ChatGPT to create these people so that while they are fake, it was a very fun practice in using AI to create a persona. If you haven't done that for your business yet, it's kind of an interesting way to see how you might be able to get rid of other people's jobs in the future. Quora is a dedicated project manager with a role at a law firm. In Washington, D.C. She lives with low vision, PTSD, and suffered from a traumatic brain injury. But she's still determined to excel in this profession. She uses technology to communicate all day, every day, either communicating with colleagues, their clients, other partners at the firm, whether it's communicating through chat or email. She does rely heavily on technology. Her disabilities do pose some unique challenges. Some frustrations that she runs into include inaccessible emails. So whether it's color contrast on the when she gets them kind of coming through, she has to change the contrast ratio on her computer, or if there's maybe too much text in an email and it's not formatted properly. Complex web forms. So if there's really kind of heavy, distracting web forms she runs into in order to fill out contact forms or chat with someone, that can be a deterrent and very difficult for her to use. Overwhelming chat interfaces, so interfaces that might have just too many options. I'm sure everyone has heard of the term analysis paralysis or decision fatigue. Stuff like that can come into play with overwhelming interfaces with all the different options and features, if they're not laid out in a very kind of intuitive or navigable way. And lastly, in their frustrations, she goes through unstructured content. So if it's just the type hierarchy is kind of off on the site, and she has a difficult time navigating and wayfinding through different blocks of content as she's looking for information, it can really be a deterrent to her job during the day. So helpful things that we can do in assistance with the kind of her visual or her needs, that visual assistance, reducing cognitive overload, the keyboard navigation, emotional triggers. We can build in screen reader compatibility. So making sure that all the websites we build are compatible with screen reading and kind of follow the flow of a naturally designed and built website or a natural user would take. We could build simplified forms. So instead of a really heavy format that might feel overwhelming for a user, we can build out simple forms that walk her through every step. So she kind of knows along the way she's making progress and it's not overwhelming for her to make decisions. We could, if we were designing a product about chat, build in customization so she can set up her environment the way that she feels most comfortable and most productive. And lastly, we can make sure the website that she's visiting, we structure the content for her. We structure it appropriately, properly with proper type hierarchy and vertical rhythm using the right heading settings. So H1 through H6 using proper body copy sizing or secondary body copy sizing, making sure that there's proper flow to our typography and our content and it's telling appropriate stories and guiding her in the appropriate directions. So one example that we wanted to pull from here, discuss the web forms best practices. A lot of people put web forms on their websites, and that's a great way to gather information and connect to your kind of users and make sure that you keep them in the pipeline and all those great things that come along with getting their information regarding marketing and the such. But there are some downsides to the way forms can be designed, from simple usage of one field. And if I miss something, Zach, feel free to chime in because there's a lot. We purposely designed this wrong, so I might miss a few things. Where you can see that first field says Fred, next field says last name and email and phone. We might start writing in these fields and not remember what we wrote. So if we look down at Verndale in the third line or over in the third column on that same line, the number 150, if we are filling this out, we don't know what we originally put there. We can't see the labels. We need to provide the user with clear direction on each form field. What do they need to fill in at each step of the way? Additionally, we see that kind of error state below the button. Even that placement feels a little off. I would just want to associate it kind of to the right of the button. And additionally, you almost want to provide at least some context. This is giving no context. It's saying the form is incomplete. Please complete the form. That's not helpful to the user. They don't know where to go, what to do. It can feel overwhelming and broken to them. So we did our best to simplify it. Fortunately, we have some great experts here that can help us design out a preferred flow for web forms and best practices. Taking something that's pretty complex, we don't want to lose that information, or maybe there's a way we can reduce the amount we ask for, but obviously a lot of that information is valuable when it comes to gathering marketing info. So maybe break it out into a stepped approach. So it's just digestible bites, nuggets of content that the user needs to enter, information that they need to enter. And we can break it up very simply with the label above the field. So it's always there. It's very kind of clear what they're looking at and what we're asking from them. Additionally, we indicate what fields are optional and what fields are required by listing out which ones are optional. So if it doesn't have that required or that optional note next to it, it's assumed optional. And then last, indicating what will happen when you click on that next button. You'll be taken to step 2, and you can fill out another series of forms there.
Okay, so the last person we want to talk about is Brian. Brian's going to be someone who has a few different challenges. He's in a wheelchair. He's also got color blindness, and he has different items that he's going to need for low-level vision. So some of the things that are happening for him are undistinguishable color combinations. This is a big one. Everyone knows about this one. The main reason for color contrast is to be able to perceive differences in content. So if I have a paragraph and one of those words is a link, I should be able to easily tell that's clickable, the other one's not. Unintuitive navigation, again, this is a problem for everyone, but making sure you really have it nailed down, that it's really clear where you can go and why you would go there. Images with no descriptions is a really rough one. I know that it's very important, especially in the marketing world, like, oh, we need to have this image and I really want to put this text on it. I want to make sure my message is in the image, but those are really hard for a lot of people to distinguish. And they're near impossible for someone with vision difficulties using the screen reader unless there's proper alt tags. So in general, making sure you always have alt tag on images and try to avoid putting text in the images themselves. You can't always control that the text is going to be clear, that the image is going to be distinguishable, and no one can read it if they can't see it clearly. And then lastly, that lack of keyboard control. So making sure that tab orders are set up. That's more of kind of a front end and development thing, but it's really important seeing as there are a lot of people that navigate with their keyboard. So general ways we can help is color contrast checker when we're doing designs, making sure that we're passing any level of accessibility needs that we need to. Alt text guidelines, so making sure that when you're producing content, you're publishing content, you've got some set of rules that everyone is following to ensure that you always have the proper information in place. You've always got your alt tag set up, and you're using descriptive information to explain to people. Screen reader and keyboard navigation, again, making sure you're developing things in a proper order that can be controlled with tab, escape, and common controls for screen readers. And then accessible collaboration tools. So if I need to work with someone, making sure that I can access it. Things like Zoom have audio only, they have video, they produce transcripts. So any of the basic tools that I need, something like Zoom is going to help me with that. Whereas if you're providing tools that don't, it may be challenging for me to work with everyone else. Some examples we have here are really around color contrast. This is a big one you see all the time. Everyone wants to have the big image that has the heading and the text over it, but it becomes really hard to read. You can't always control what's going to be there. So this would be a bad example. Can't read the headline, can't read the description. I know there's a button there, but I may not understand what else is there because I haven't put the due diligence into making sure it's contrast compliant. And then Chris, I know you put up some examples of how we could do that a little bit better.
Sure, yeah. So the next few slides, there are just a few different visual representations of how we can ensure color contrast is met across our designs. So at least at Burndale, when we're designing, let's say a masthead or hero area like this, and there's a background image, and we need to make sure that no matter what image the content author uploads, we are going to be hitting the proper contrast ratio. And that's why we chose a picture with cloud stuff and they have kind of white in them. So we want to make sure that a content author, if they upload an all white image, we have proper contrast ratio to ensure the text is legible on there. We also want to make sure we're not dimming or losing too much in an image. So if the website calls for brighter treatments, maybe we use a form of white box overlay that lets a little bit of the image poke out, but definitely lets the text stay legible on top of it. And there are different alignments. We could maybe place it on the bottom or on the right using a shadow to let it kind of stick out. There are just endless possibilities for how we could treat this. These are just a few that we decided to kind of incorporate. But of course, there's a lot of creative ways to make sure the content's legible, but still feel great and feel like your brand. This is something Zach had said in the passing once, and I just held on to it and I love it. You don't need to look like Craigslist to be accessible. So if you're not familiar with Craigslist, it is a more or less shopping site where users can go on and sell things. Not shopping, but users can go on and sell goods or sell things there, and it's very bare bones. It's kind of notorious in at least the design and web design world is not aesthetically pleasing. And there's a lot of maybe bad connotations there that's what you need to look like to ensure you're accessible. And we don't think that's true. We actually have proof of that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different websites we've done that I'm sure all of you have also done as well over the years or looked at that are visually interesting, they're creative, you're still encasing yourself in their brand digitally, that can still be accessible. It's really just a matter of thinking out of the box for what can you do to meet those guidelines and what can you do to kind of go above and beyond to be thinking about how users can enjoy your content while still fitting within your needs. So one of those examples for us is Acadian Asset Management. So they were ones that really wanted to push the boundaries of looking technical, looking modern, having a lot of different animations, having a really bold look. So we were able to use a lot of contrasting colors with dark and with white to make sure they stand out. We use things like carets, arrows, and strong hover states to make sure that wherever you're going, it's very clear what is and isn't interactable, and use a lot of big imagery. So it still is engaging, it still is fun and nice to look at, but it's still compliant. And for any of these, we like to use Google Lighthouse because it's a really quick scan. And any of these websites we put forward, we aim for a 90 or higher. Most of them end up in like a 95, which is really good. Another big one that's kind of in that financial sector, but also crosses over into education, is United Educators. Education is one of the sectors that gets chased down for this type of stuff the most. If anyone is in education or has worked with it, they know that accessibility and WCAG is always on their mind. So similar situation here where they still wanted to have kind of a strong identity. They wanted to be very bold but trustworthy. So we have a lot of high contrast blues. We're using shadows to denote content, really strong heading labels, and we still have some room to be a little bit more fun and provide high level functions that are still clear. Again, this is a 97 on accessibility, so even though it does have a little bit of visual interest, it's still very compliant. It's not going to be getting any issues, and it's still going to let the content speak for itself and be engaging.
The last example we wanted to provide to everyone was Aspen Snowmass. So Aspen Snowmass is, the premier location in Aspen for travel enthusiasts and vacation goers in that area. And they had just gone through a great rebranding exercise, a very simplified brand where it's really three colors: black, white, and red. Red was their pop color. So as far as color compliance goes, it was fairly easy to make sure we hit that, as the blacks kind of really popped off of the whites and things like that. But we wanted to make sure everything had a little bit of motion, a little bit of movement, and it felt as engaging as the experience of being at Aspen is. So anytime that you interact with a piece, it still moves, but there's the ability to kind of turn off certain videos if you have kind of motion impairments. We want to make sure it's very clear where you can play and pause items, where you can navigate through different things that may be moving, or how to turn those off. And it just keep the user engaged through their bright imagery and through the kind of the pops of red throughout the design. Another one that hit a 97, so that was exciting to see as well.
Okay, so we went a little bit over time here, but hopefully covered a lot of ground on thinking about accessibility in the digital world, how it relates to others, and general needs. There will also be sending out a recording of this and some take-along materials that have a little bit more step-by-step guides of how to adhere to certain compliances. But thanks for joining, and if anyone can stay later and wants to ask any questions, we're more than happy to field those. If not, then have a fantastic day.